Hello and welcome to the first screencast for Econ 2301, Thinking Like an Economist. So economics is a social science, and there are several other social sciences, as you're probably aware. If you could write down on a piece of paper what you think those other social sciences are, we can maybe discuss their relationship to economics in the next class. So economists, what do they do? At least academic economists, that is. Well, we have methods which we basically have adopted from science, but that doesn't make economists scientists. They are social scientists, a type of scientist, I guess, that doesn't apply their theories to physical things. We apply our theories and try and prove and disprove our theories to essentially human behavior, either as individuals, firms, or governments, or macroeconomy in general. So first of all, we devise theories, and just like a scientist would devise a theory about, for instance, gravity, as Newton did, and then we collect data to try and prove or disprove our theories, and then we analyze those data using various techniques, and those techniques are mostly statistical techniques, and those hopefully verify or refute the theories that we've originally devised or hypothesized. As a social scientist, the academic economist uses, as I said, a method from science which is essentially called the scientific method. And the scientific method takes a lot of the subjectivity out of what we do. It's a dispassionate development and testing of theories about how the world works. And essentially, we look at what we observe. We then theorize about those phenomena, those events, and we can observe more as well. We can also conduct experiments, and there's a whole field now in economics called experimental economics. Sometimes it's called behavioral economics as well. It's not impossible, but a lot of the time it is difficult to do, and certainly in macroeconomics it is virtually impossible to conduct an experiment. So most of the experimental economics subject matter is actually applied in micro, not macro. In terms of observation, we pay close attention to natural experiments. This is particularly the case in macro, for instance, where the government might change their policy, and we try and observe the behavior of individuals in response to that change in government policy. When we are theorizing, there are so many things that are going on at the same time in the real world that as economists we have to make some assumptions about behavior in order to construct our theories. And the objective here is obviously to simplify what is a very complex world and try and make it easier to understand. To do that, we have to really get to the essence of the problem that we're looking at. And in order to focus our thinking, it necessitates that we use those assumptions, usually to get rid of other variables that may affect what's going on, and to then get to the essence of whatever the problem is. There are different sets of assumptions that we can make, and economists spend a lot of time arguing about those assumptions, arguing about things like, can we really ignore this other event in what we do, or do we have to take that into consideration? So an example of that in the macro world would be, for instance, what determines how much we spend, what economists call consumption. Now, it's obvious that income is likely a factor that affects consumption, so how much we earn affects how much we can spend. But of course you might say, well, you can't just take those two variables and put that into what we call a theory, because there are other things that obviously also determine how much we spend. You might say, well, what? Well, for instance, the value of what we have as assets. So, how much we might have in the stock market, how much our house is worth, many other factors as well that might affect how much we spend. So, those are the types of things which economists argue about in terms of the assumptions that we make when we construct our theories. And obviously we're going to make different assumptions depending on what we're trying to study and what we're trying to look at. We also have to take into account that certain things happen in what we call the short run, and other things we might be concerned about that happen over a much longer period of time. What do I mean by a short run? Well, usually short run we're talking about over the next year, over the next, at the most, a couple of years. When we're talking about the long run, though, we're usually talking about a much longer period of time, 10, 20 years, a couple of decades, or even more. So the assumptions that we make are going to be very different depending on, what we're looking at. Give you another example here. If we're looking at what determines spending over time, if it's a short period of time, the value of our houses probably doesn't change all that much. What might change is our wages, how much we are able to earn for doing a given amount of work. So in the short run, we might assume that our wealth is constant. Now in the long run, that's really not going to be the case. In the long run, obviously, the value of our houses and how that changes over time is going to be a big factor in explaining how much we actually spend. Other factors as well, like the stock market going up or down over the long run, will obviously affect how much we spend. So the theories that economists come up with are usually embodied or usually put into what we call an economic model. This consists usually of diagrams and equations, typically equations, and as I said, it makes assumptions, so we omit a lot of details, and the point of doing that is not to make the real world or not to reflect the real world. The point is to hopefully allow us to see what's really important, to distill all these variables down into the most important variables. So, we do use assumptions. Sometimes a lot of people think we use too many assumptions, and in fact there's a running joke about economists, making way too many assumptions. But that's what we do. We simplify reality by focusing on what's important to us, and the objective at the end of the day is to try and understand human behavior, understand these different phenomena that human behavior causes in an economic sense. The simplest macro model that we have is the so-called circular flow diagram. It's a visual model of the economy. It shows how dollars flow through markets between households and firms. It's for the whole economy, so therefore it's a macroeconomic model. Although even with a macroeconomic model, we obviously can have households, and a household here is basically a living unit. In other words, whether it's a family or whether it's a single person household or whether it's even a hippie commune, that would be called a single household. And households obviously survive by consuming goods and services, and at the same time they supply their labor to firms, and firms produce goods and services. So you can see already there's a flow of products going on, and there's also going to be a flow of money going on. So the decision makers are the firms and households. Firms decide what to make, how much to make of it. Households decide what to buy, how much to buy of it. And the exchange of goods and services goes through one market, if you like. A market is where buyers and sellers come together to exchange those goods and services, and the households supply what we call their labor, so they supply that to the firms, and that is done through a market for what we call factors of production, the things that go into producing items. Now, as I said already, firms, they produce the goods and services. They use what we call the factors of production together with inputs to produce what they produce. Now, by factors of production, the factors of production are land, particularly when you're talking about agricultural products, labor, and that's workers essentially, what we call capital, and capital is defined as plant, machinery, equipment, buildings, etc. And lastly, entrepreneurship. And I'll go over those again in the next class. So those are the things that kind of are employed by the firm, or the factors of production, or used by the firm. And the inputs are the things that are used to produce and are usually part of the product that we end up buying. So to give you an example, labor would obviously be a factor of production in, for instance, producing donuts. Wheat, however, would not be a factor of production. It would be an input into producing donuts. Why? Well, when we look at the actual production process that a firm goes through, there are inputs, there are things that the firm uses as part of the product it produces, and there are outputs. Well, the output in this case is the donut that the firm actually produces and is able to sell to households. So, households, here we go. They own the factors of production. Every factor of production is owned by someone, particularly if it's in the private sector, privately owned. So it's owned by the household. In some cases, the factors of production can be owned by state firms, in which case they're owned by the government. In which cases we own the government, ultimately we have a stake in that as well. And each household, once again, owns part of that production process, or those factors of production. The households consume goods and services, essentially. And so, we live in a consumer society, and the consumers are basically represented in this model, in this setup, by the households. As I said, there's two markets: the market for factors of for goods and services. In these two markets, or in this market, the firms are the sellers, obviously, because they sell the goods and services. The households are the buyers; they purchase the goods and services. In terms of the market for factors of production, the firms are the buyers of those. By the way, there's an error here. That should not read inputs, markets for inputs. That should read markets for factors of production. The firms are the buyers, and the households are the sellers there. Now, just as a test, in terms of the inputs, where does the firm get those from? Does it get those from households? The answer is no, it doesn't. It tends to buy those inputs from other firms. So think of the company making donuts is going to buy the inputs it needs from other companies or other firms, basically. So here's the circular flow diagram, and you can see the way it's set up. Now, let's go to the inner loop first of all, which is the red arrows, and let's start off at the households. So the households are on the right-hand side. The first red arrow is down to the bottom right, and it's the factors of production which the households supply through the market for factors of production, and they supply, there should be 4 factors of production. Mancu's bad here, he misses out one. So there's labor, land, capital, which I've already defined as plant, machinery and equipment, and entrepreneurship. So those are all supplied through the market for factors of production to the firms, and the firm buys those and pays for those. Okay, just a test of your understanding. If the firm buys labor, what does it pay for that labor? Well, here you go. You can see the green arrows, which represent the flow of money in the bottom part of the diagram, going from firms through the market for factors of production to the households. So if you are hired by a firm, you would be represented in terms of your labor input. Labor is a factor of production as the red arrow, but you're paid wages, and that's represented by the green arrow. And once the firm pays those to its factors of production, you think of that, of course, when it comes to you as a household, you think of that as income. And that's what the bottom right-hand green arrow shows. What are the other factors of production paid? Well, land is paid rent. Why is land paid rent? Well, because if you own land, you can be used as a factor of production by, say, another farmer, and you would charge him or her rent for that piece of land. Now, with capital, it's a bit more tricky to work out what the payment is to capital, but it is, if you think about it, if a firm wants to get a piece of equipment, usually it has to take a loan, and that loan, usually a bank will charge it interest for that loan. So the piece of equipment must earn at least the rate of interest that the bank is charging to make it worthwhile the company buying that piece of equipment. Economists say that the piece of equipment, therefore, is paid the rate of interest. Okay, so that's what's paid to capital, plant, machinery, and equipment. Now, what about entrepreneurs? What are they paid? Well, entrepreneurs are paid for setting up the companies. They are paid an amount which we call profit in economics. So entrepreneurs earn profit as a factor of production. Let's look at the top part of the diagram now, and let's start off with the firms. Once again, of course, they're selling goods and services to the households. Households demand those goods and services, and that's represented by the red arrow. And you can see that those are sold through the market for goods and services and bought by households. In return, what the firms get? Well, they get money, and that is represented on the right-hand side, top green arrow, as spending, and that then, from the firm's point of view, is revenue for producing their products and selling their products. So that's the circular flow diagram. And if we have no trade with foreign countries, and that's what's one of the assumptions in setting up this diagram, of course, there is no foreign trade, you can see here, then this is the flow of money and the flow of goods and services and factors of production throughout the economy. Now, one of the things about this, you can see, is that, everything, if you buy something, if you think about it, so look at the green arrow there, every dollar of that will be a revenue to a firm. And everything that a firm earns is paid to someone. It's either paid to the labor that they employ, or it's paid to the bank for their loan that they had to get the machines to produce the stuff, or it's paid to the farmer who owns the land, that would be rent, or it's paid to the entrepreneurs. And hence, everything that you spend money on when you buy a product is income to someone. So if you think about it, that green arrow in the top right-hand part of the diagram must be equal at some point to the green arrow at the bottom right-hand part of the diagram. And as the right-hand green arrow must be equal to the left-hand green arrow, then you can see that, in fact, the flows around this must be the same for each quadrant, for top right, top left, bottom right. This is, for a lot of students, a kind of a green light going off, a green light going off, in terms of course, the flow of money around the economy. If we assume that none of it leaks out, and in this diagram none of it leaks out, whatever's spent on any good or service is an income to someone. Absolutely. So this is one of the insights we get from setting up this model. Another thing that we can do is to look at, given the fact that we have a certain amount of resources, what can we produce? And economists look at this by setting up what we call the production possibilities frontier. It's a graph. And what it says is that given that we have a certain amount of resources, given that we have a certain amount of factors of production, a certain amount of raw materials as well, etc., etc., this is the maximum combinations of output that we could possibly produce, assuming everyone is working 100% all the time and that we're using everything that we have. So we're given the available factors of production. We also are assuming that we have a certain production technology. So whatever the level of technology is at a specific point in time. So obviously, our production possibilities frontier, what we can produce, will have been a lot less, say 100 years ago, than what we can produce today, just because we have much better technology now than we had back then. Think of this in terms of, if you're having problems with this, in terms of, agriculture, for example. 100 years ago, our agricultural methods, our agricultural machinery wasn't as good or efficient as it is today. So we can obviously get a lot more agricultural output by using this better machinery and less labor, for that matter. There's a lot less people working on the land now. And so that's the production technology that we're talking about. This is what a production possibilities frontier looks like. What we're going to assume is make a very simple assumption and say, okay, we can produce either one product or another product. So one of the products we're going to consider here would be the number of cars that we could produce, or we could produce computers. So remember what the production possibilities frontier is. It's a mapping. It shows the maximum amount of each of these two things that we could possibly produce. So let's look at the horizontal axis. It says that if we used all our resources, we could produce at maximum in our economy 1,000 cars. Look at the vertical axis. If we produced all our resources, used all our resources, we could produce at maximum 3,000 computers. Now, of course, we can produce combinations of those two things as well. We could produce some computers and some cars. So here we have different points that are on the production possibilities frontier. Now, that blue line there is the production possibilities frontier. So if we're actually on the frontier, it's telling us that we're using all our resources, we're producing the maximum number of cars and computers that we possibly can. But of course, the more cars we produce, the less computers we can produce. That's why that's kind of downward sloping. Now we're going to get into why it's outwardly bowed later on. But a couple of things to test your understanding. Can we produce at point C? Well, the answer is no, we can't, because that's outside of our production possibilities frontier. We cannot get to point C. Why? Because we just don't have the resources, the factors of production, etc., to get to point C. Can we produce at point D, which is inside the production possibility frontier in that blue shaded area? The answer is absolutely yes, we can produce there. We could produce, and look at the point D, we could produce 300 cars and 1,000 computers. Would that be an efficient use of all our resources? The answer is no. We could increase the number of cars that we produce and increase the numbers of computers that we could produce. In other words, we could move from a point like D to a point like B or A. We could even move to a point like E, so producing less computers but a lot more cars. Or we could move to a point like F as well. Either way, if we are on that production possibility frontier, we are using all the resources that we have. So we are being what economists call efficient. And here we go, efficient levels of production. So the economy is squeezing all it can out of the resources available. And those are the points on the production possibilities frontier. Clearly, and let's go back to that graph again, if we move down the production possibility frontier, say from a point like A to a point like B, there's clearly a trade-off going on. So if we look at point A and point B, if we move from point A to point B, what are we giving up? Well, we're clearly giving up 200 computers, because we're moving from a point where we were producing 2,200 computers to a point where we're producing only 2,000. What are we trading that off for? What are we getting in its place? We're moving from 600 cars to 700 cars. So the trade-off here, you can see, in moving from point A to point B, would be we're giving up 200 computers to get an extra 100 cars. So that would be the trade-off that we are making if we decided as a country to move from point A to point B. So if we're on the production possibility frontier already, the only way to produce more of one good is to produce less of another good. And that's the trade-off. We've already talked about points that are inefficient, and those are points that are inside the production possibility frontier. So going back to the diagram, D is an inefficient point. And we can't get to points outside the production possibility frontier. They are what we call non-feasible points. So we cannot get there. They're non-feasible. Now, already you can probably guess what I'm going to talk about when I talked about moving from that point A to point B. We're giving up computers to produce more vehicles. That is what economists call the opportunity cost. It's what you give up of one good to produce more of the other good. And in terms of the production possibility frontier, the slope of that production possibility frontier reflects the trade-off, because it's how much you give up of one thing to get more of something else. So to go from A to B, the slope of that represents the trade-off, represents therefore the opportunity cost, what you give up to get something else. Now, why is the production possibility frontier outwardly bowed, or bowed outwardly? Well, it's because as we move down the production possibility frontier, essentially we're moving resources from producing one type of good to producing another type of good. So let's go back to our diagram and look at what would happen if we did that. So if we're moving from a point like F, where we're producing nearly all computers, to a point like A, where we're producing less computers but quite a few more cars, what's the trade-off going on? Or what's going on there in terms of the movement? Well, the trade-off is obviously, we're going to be producing less computers for more cars. That's the trade-off. So if we're going to move resources from producing computers to cars, which ones are we going to move first? Well, I would suggest, if we were going to do that, that we'd move resources that are least good at producing computers and that are best at producing cars. So that means that when we produce them, we're actually going to get a big bang for, well, not buck exactly, a big bang from the first movement of capital, the first movement of machinery and equipment and workers, as well, labor, over to the car industry. And we're going to move the best car-making people and the best car-making machinery and equipment, capital in other words, over to the car industry. At the same time, we're going to lose some computers. In other words, we're not going to be producing those computers. So you can see the opportunity cost there is fairly flat because that's on a flat part of the production possibility frontier. In other words, you can see that the slope there between F and A is fairly flat. Okay? Now, if we were to move on the other end from B to E, for instance, we would be giving up a lot of computers to produce just a few more cars. Why is that? In other words, the opportunity cost is very high. It's because we're moving resources now that don't have a particular specialization. They don't have a particular talent, if you like, at producing cars. They probably have more of a talent in producing computers, or better equipped to produce computers. So we're going to be moving those resources, so we don't expect to get too many more extra cars when we move those resources. Hence the opportunity cost of shifting down from B to E is pretty high in terms of what we give up. So we're giving up a lot of computers to get only a few extra cars. So from 700 to say 1,000 cars, extra cars. So the opportunity cost is highest in terms of what we give up to get those cars at the bottom part of the production possibility frontier, and it's least at the top part of the production possibility frontier. So here, this just basically shows you what I've derived here, already talked about. The opportunity cost of a car is clearly highest when the economy is producing already many cars and few computers, because when we transfer the resources, they're really not best suited to producing cars. And the opportunity cost of a car is lowest when we're producing already lots of computers, and we're moving the resources that are best equipped to producing cars. So this also suggests that this bowed outward shape of the production possibility frontier is due to resource specialization. Now, if we have a technological advance, if we have an improvement in our machinery and equipment, then usually this means that we can produce more of everything. Think of the advent of, for instance, computers. The advent of computers has meant that we could computerize a lot of processes, and that meant that we could produce more. Why? Because a lot of things could be computerized. That means the people who were doing those jobs before could actually do other useful things instead of filing and doing a lot of clerical work, for example. That leads to economic growth, and it leads to economic growth because we can produce with the same resources, the same factors of production, we can produce more of both goods. How do we show that? Well, here we can show that very clearly on a diagram. Now let's assume in this case that the technology advances for the production of computers, but it doesn't change for the production of cars. So in other words, the machinery and equipment that's available to produce computers is suddenly better, can produce more computers in a given period of time, whereas the machinery and equipment that's available to produce cars cannot produce more cars. So here you can see what happens to the PPC. The point where we produce all cars, in other words, the intercept with the horizontal axis, that doesn't change because we can't produce any more cars given the technology. What does happen, though, is that given the improvement in technology is completely concentrated in the computing sector, is that the whole PPC shifts up, if you like, so that the intercept is now on the vertical axis. Instead of 3,000 computers, it's now 4,000 computers. What does that mean if we're producing both computers and vehicles? Well, as you can see, if we're at a point like A, in fact, it means we can produce more computers and we can produce more vehicles. We can't produce any more than the maximum number of vehicles if we put our resources into vehicles, but if we're producing a blend of both, say at point A, it means that we can produce 100 more computers and we're producing 50 more cars. So technology, you can see, enhances the amount of things that we can produce throughout the economy, not just in the one sector. Why is that, by the way? Well, the reason is that, because we have better machinery and equipment in the computing sector, it means that we can maybe take some of the labor that was used in the computing sector and put that labor into producing cars. Even with the same technology in the car industry, that means we can produce more cars. Okay, the next section in this chapter is talking about the split in our subject between what we call microeconomics and macroeconomics. Now, I've already really been through this in the intro, so I'm going to go pretty fast through it. Micro is really focused on individuals, households, and firms and how they behave, how they make decisions, how they interact, and particularly how they interact in markets. Macro is the study of the whole economy, so it's phenomena such as growth, economic growth that is, how how fast prices in the economy as a whole go up, how many people are working, and how many people are not working. That's unemployment and employment. And as economists, we have two ways of looking at the world. The first, which is linked to the scientific method, is the use of positive statements. And these positive statements are used to describe the world as it is. They are descriptive, and they are used, obviously, in terms of constructing theories, and that's why positive statements are important. Usually a positive statement does not have a word like could or should or ought to in it. It's purely descriptive about the world. And the way in which we find out whether positive statements are correct or false is by looking at the evidence. So economists like to use positive statements. It's what usually economists try to stick to. Academic economists, that is. Now, the opposite of that is the so-called normative statements. Now, those are statements of what should happen, or what could happen, or what ought to happen. So it's an attempt to prescribe how the world should be. And this is used a lot in politics, and when economists are asked their opinions about things. So it's prescriptive. It's saying what should happen. When your doctor gives a prescription, it's to make you better. When an economist gives a prescription, it's a normative statement. In other words, it would be, we should lower taxes to stimulate the economy. For example, that would be a normative statement. A positive statement on that line would be, when taxes go down, spending goes up, and that stimulates the economy. Okay, well that's a testable theory, and we go and look at, therefore, if taxes do go down, does spending go up? And if so, does that boost economic growth? So you can see hopefully the difference between a positive statement and a normative statement. I'll give you an example from outside of economics. A positive statement might be, smoking is the major cause of lung cancer in the United States. Okay, that's something we can test. We know how many people smoked, and we know how many people got lung cancer, so we can look at the relationship between the two. We can get data and test it. A normative statement is, you should give up smoking because it will kill you. Okay, now there's no ought, there's a should word in there. You should give up smoking because it will kill you. Well, that's a normative statement, because one, if you smoke, it doesn't necessarily kill you, but it's also saying it's trying to prescribe your behavior. It's trying to tell you what you should do. Hopefully you understand the difference between the two now with that example as well. Okay, so what do economists do? Well, there are lots of economists in Washington, D.C. In fact, the Council of Economic Advisors is probably the most well-known group of economists. They advise the President of the United States, and they also are involved in writing the annual economic report of the President, which is available free online. But economists are also employed in the Office of Management and Budget. That looks over the government's budget. The Department of the Treasury, they monitor the taxes coming in when you pay taxes. The Department of Labor, that they look at how to try and stimulate the amount of jobs in the US economy, the level of unemployment. There are economists also in the Department of Justice. They look at kind of more micro issues, like if we start to regulate this particular industry, what are going to be the economic effects? The Congressional Budget Office, well, that obviously looks at the government budget again, but for Congress, and the Federal Reserve. Now, the Federal Reserve is our central bank, and we'll come to talk about the Federal Reserve a lot later on, but for the moment it's basically a state agency, and it essentially prints our money, prints the dollar, and it's the monopoly issuer of the dollar. It's the only entity that's legally allowed to print dollars in the country. And they obviously look after the monetary side of the economy, that is interest rates and how many dollars are out there in the economy. So that's where economists are employed in Washington. But the president doesn't have just economists telling him or suggesting what he should do. He also has communication advisors, how to look best, in other words, how to dress up policy in the best way. Press advisors, how to impress the media and get the message over through the media. Legislative affairs advisors, so in other words, is a policy going to break the law? Political advisors, how to get re-elected. And of course, then the president has to make a decision. So why economists' advice is not always followed? Well, it's pretty simple. Economic advice is only one part of the advice that the president is given. So the president can choose to ignore what the economists say and go for what might get them re-elected. They can ignore what economists say to make them look better in the press. Maybe they ignore what economists say because they think it might be legally problematic. So why do economists disagree? There's an old joke which says if you get any number of economists into a room, you won't get any consensus at all. That's not quite true. Economists do agree on a lot of things, but we also disagree on a lot of things. And the reason why we disagree is because, whichever positive theory you put forward, obviously people are going to question the validity of the assumptions and the validity of the actual theory itself. So economists disagree because of those reasons. Economists also have different values. In other words, economists are also political. So you get right-wing economists and you get left-wing economists. Obviously, left-wing economists tend to think that the government can do good. Right-wing economists tend to want to see less of government. So economists also do have their own political views, but those political views should not come out in their work. Although sometimes it's unavoidable. You see economists presenting their work, but also coming out with some opinions as well. So, why do economists disagree? We've already talked a little bit about this, but those scientific judgments that economists have, and once again, it is judgment. They are different. So economists have different hunches about, for instance, the validity of some of the alternative theories and the size of what we call important parameters. So in other words, to give you an example, if income goes up by a certain amount, how much of that money will be spent? Is it is it better, for instance, for government to spend more on projects, on capital projects, in other words, building new roads, highways, bridges, or is it better for the government to cut taxes? So it depends on your view about those parameters, about what you think will be the amount that is passed into the economy as a whole, that determines, which you favor. So here we have another example. How big is the government multiplier? So in other words, if the government tries to stimulate the economy, and this current administration has tried to stimulate the economy over the past 3 years, does $1 more of government spending contribute? How much does it contribute to the macroeconomy as a whole? Now the consensus is that $1 spent by the government contributes to the economy by creating another 0.8 of a dollar, in other words 80 cents of a dollar in spending. But not all economists agree on that. Why? Because it's extremely hard to measure. So differences in values, for instance, here. So Peter and Paul are here. They take the same amount of water from the town well. Peter's income is 50,000 and Paula's income is 10,000. and if they're taxed on that basis, they're taxed at maybe different levels here. You can see the tax on Peter's income turns out to be 5,000 for taking that, and he's charged at 10%. And Paula's income is 10,000, but she's charged at 20% of her income. She pays less though, 2,000. So is that fair, you might ask? Well, from Peter's point of view, it's not fair, because even though he's paying a lower percentage, he's paying a higher dollar amount. From Paula's point of view, it's not fair either, because even though she's paying a smaller amount, she's paying a higher percentage. So you can see the differences in values here often relate to the dollar figures versus percentage figures, for example, in this case. So, economists often have a lot of argument about, for instance, in the tax system, what is fair. Should the rich pay more in taxes? Well, they're already paying a lot in terms of dollars to the federal government, for example, but a lot of other people say, well, no, they're not paying all that much because they're not actually paying a very high percentage. So economists do have, different viewpoints on this as well. And you see that in the media, by the way. There's also perception versus reality. And, for instance, a good example of this is rent control. So in most major cities, there is a control, or there's legislation that's enacted to ensure that rents are not increased above and beyond a certain percentage. But that obviously limits the amount that landlords can increase the rents by. And a lot of economists, or some economists, propose this as a means to try and help the poor. And you can see it does. It controls their rents in particular. But it does have unintended consequences. It does adversely affect the availability and the quality of housing. If you're a landlord and you know you can only increase the rent by a certain amount, it doesn't kind of encourage you to build lots of new apartments. So it's a very costly way, in a way, of helping the neediest members of society. Many cities do use rent control. What it leads to, and we're going to see this later on, is it leads to an apartment rental stock, if you like, that is the quality of the apartments that are available for rent, do not increase over time. And it doesn't lead to any incentive for the landlord to actually improve those apartments and make them better. Another example would be trade barriers. A lot of politicians are encouraged to put trade barriers into effect, that is to restrict the imports of certain goods. Nearly all economists oppose doing this, but you can see why they're doing it. Often they're doing it to help a specific industry. In this country, for instance, we've had barriers to importing foreign steel for a long time. Why? To try and help our steel industry. It's very, you might say, well, that's a good thing. Well, a lot of economists would disagree and say that's a bad thing, because if we can't compete with foreigners in terms of producing steel, maybe we shouldn't be producing steel at all. But of course there's a huge political pressure on politicians to try and protect the jobs that we currently have. So that's something else also we're going to be discussing. So here are some of the propositions about which most economists agree. So I'm going to read through these and comment on them. So 93% of all economists agree that the ceiling on rents reduces the quantity and quality of housing available. And I think I went through the rationale, the reasoning for that. The reason is that, if you restrict the rent that you can charge, it doesn't give landlords an incentive to provide more apartments or to improve the apartments that they currently have. Second proposition is that tariffs and import quotas usually reduce general economic welfare. The idea here is that if you restrict imports, what does that mean? Usually it means that the domestic producers of, for instance, steel can charge more because they don't have to worry about any foreign competition. That means we pay more. Consumers tend to pay more. And that reduces our economic welfare. And there's a whole bunch there of other propositions as well, where you can see that where economists largely agree on those particular propositions. And there's a whole bunch more. You can see as we go down the list, though, there's less agreement. And indeed, this is why we have the debates that we have in our discipline. That's the end of the screencast, by the way. There is an appendix, and you can see it begins here. I'm not going to go through this in class. I will let you, as an out-of-class assignment, particularly if you're not familiar with graphing or with some math as well. There is some math in here, but these are specifically explaining different types of graphs. I will let you go through this, particularly if you're not, if you want a refresher, or if you're not familiar with graphing and how to put things onto graphs. This is something we will be covering later on. It's a demand curve. It shows the quantity of a product bought dependent on the price. So you can see it's downward sloping. Why is that? Well, the cheaper the price of the good, the more that consumers want to buy. That's why it's downward sloping. And you can see here that the price of the particular book here, it's the price of novels, assuming that all novels are the same price, comes down. Consumers buy more of the book. In this case, it's only one consumer. It's a woman called Emma. And here we're going to show how those curves shift around, and we show them on a diagram as well. And the slope of any curve, you should have done this in basic math, but it's the rise over the run. So it's the vertical distance, the change in y over change in x, and you can apply that to a PPC as well. PPF, sorry, production possibility frontier. So by the way, sometimes the production possibility frontier, the PPF, is called the PPC, the production possibility curve. I'm going to use those two interchangeably in class. There's a couple of things I do want to emphasize here. When we're doing graphs, we're assuming that one set of events causes another set of events. Of course, we could omit variables here. It could lead to a deceptive graph. And we could have reverse causality. So for instance, with our demand curve that we saw before, so here's a demand curve, and actually on this demand curve, calculating the slope of the demand curve, the rise over the run here. But with this demand curve, what we're assuming is that the price, which is on the vertical axis, causes the quantity on the horizontal axis to be demanded. Okay, so if the price is 8 on the vertical axis, you read that across, then 13 novels will be bought. Okay, so we're assuming that that's the causality, a flow of causality, so going from the price to how much is bought. But it could be the other way around. In many cases, it could be that instead of event A causing event B, it could be event B causing event A. Not in this case with the demand, but there are other circumstances where something, we think that maybe event A causes B, but it's not. It's event B causing A. We'll get onto some of those later in the class. So just go over this graph here, graph suggesting reverse causality, if I can get the thing to come up. So here we have the risk of cancer on the vertical axis, the number of lighters in the house on the horizontal axis. So in other words, here we would say, well, does the risk of cancer cause the number of lighters in the house? No, there's obviously an omitted variable here. And what is the omitted variable? Obviously, smoking, right? But we can't conclude that ownership of lighters causes cancer, because there's an omitted variable, and that is the number of times those lighters light up cigarettes, right? So here's a graph suggesting reverse causality. So is violent crime on the vertical axis causing police officers? No. We would say that it's likely to be it's likely to say that cities with a higher concentration of police are more dangerous, and therefore there's more violent crime. But it's not the police officers that are causing the violent crime. It's violent crimes that cause a large number of police officers to be in those cities for a third reason, an omitted variable, in other words. Okay, so that's the end of the class. Hope you enjoyed it.